My name is Aidan Sank. I am a Stuttering ally and the executive director and co-founder of Space, which is a brand new not-for-profit organization. Our mission is to create a more inclusive and accessible world for people who stutter, and ultimately, by doing that, to create a more inclusive and accessible world for everyone. And I think that that is sort of centrally what I want to talk about today. The idea that when we create space for stuttering, we ultimately create space for everyone else too. I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about some of the lessons that I've learned in my time with the stuttering community over the last 12 plus years. And I think very often when folks talk about I think especially fluent folks talk about the things that they learn from people who stutter, traditionally, often that takeaway is, I learned how to be a better listener. And I think that's legit, right? And I think that that's true, and that is certainly true for me. But I think the thing that I've really been thinking about most centrally is the idea that working with and getting to know people who stutter has actually made me a better communicator, not just a better listener. I think societally right now, the way we look at communication is really interesting, and I think often really wrong. I think very often as a society, the way that we look at communication is we are prioritizing efficient communication over effective communication. And so I think societally, the way that we look at what constitutes good communication is smooth communication, fluent communication, quick communication, communication that doesn't contain disfluency. We've set up this standard that efficient, faster, smoother is better. Ultimately, I don't actually think there is a correlation between efficient communication that is fast and smooth and fluent, and effective communication, because you can be a really poor communicator and not stutter at all, in the same way that you can be a really excellent communicator and stutter quite a lot. I think when we're thinking about what makes a really great communicator, we think about things like ability to put your ideas together, intelligence, ability to connect, ability to listen, ability to empathize, ability to put together a solid structure of a speech or an argument or whatever it is that you are communicating. And I think that time and time again, the lesson that I've learned is that people who stutter are amongst the most effective communicators that I have met and that I know in my life. And I think when I started with the stuttering community at age 19, I think I was a very efficient communicator. I think that I communicated very, very quickly and very smoothly. I don't know that I was a very effective communicator. And I think my time in the stuttering community has made me an effective communicator. And I think that the central thing that makes a great communicator stand out is their ability to create space and to be comfortable with space and to recognize that great communication isn't always about what we as the communicator are saying. Sometimes it's about what we are not doing and what we are not saying. And this, in so many ways, I think is so central to Space's central philosophy of creating space for stuttering. Because I think as an organization, we seek to create space for stuttering in a multitude of different ways. In a very large sense, we are seeking to create space for stuttering in society. We are looking to advocate for people who stutter, to make conditions for those who stutter better, to increase stuttering representation, to make sure that stuttering stigma is significantly reduced and eliminated. In a large and macro sense, we're creating space for stuttering. We're also creating literal spaces for people who stutter and for stuttering. And for us, the predominant example of that is our Space Community and Arts program, where youth and young adults who stutter can come and find connection and community and a space where they can stutter as much as feels comfortable to them, as much as they want to. In a micro sense as well, at Space, we're looking to create space for stuttering in our everyday conversations, in the way that we communicate. And I think that so frequently what we see in the outside world is that society struggles to create space for stuttering for a number of reasons, but one central in my mind a lot is that we as society, I think, are really uncomfortable with the idea of silence, of literal space. And so often stuttering can be one of the examples of when we think about a block in stuttering, that is such an example of silence. And for the listener, it's a silence that you don't have control over, right? It's a silence that is created by someone other than yourself. And so often, I think as fluent speakers, we feel this anxiety and this need to insert ourselves into that silence, to fill that silence, because silence equals shame, or silence equals awkwardness, or silence equals something going wrong, ultimately. And if we start to recognize silence and space as something that is just as important as the words that are being said, we begin to feel comfortable with any waves of uncomfortability that may roll over us in those moments. If we begin to, as one of our community members recently suggested, take a breath as the listener when we are stuttering, instead of asking the person who stutters to take a breath, as the listener, we take a breath and become present and comfortable in that silence. We start to shift the nature of what communication is and what communication can be. And I think a big thing that we are trying to do at Space is the idea of redefining what great really is, including stuttering in that definition. And so just to lay out for a second the structure of Space and the way that we seek to achieve this mission of creating a more inclusive and accessible world for people who stutter, and by extension, everyone else. Let's just talk a second about the way that we do that. So for Space, when we think about creating a more inclusive and accessible world, we sort of like split that up into two halves. On the one hand, if you want to make conditions better for people who stutter, you want a more inclusive and accessible world for those who stutter, you need services directly for folks who stutter. And so for us, as I said before, the predominant example of that is our Space Community and Arts program. We are for sure, centrally focused on giving folks who stutter direct services. At the same time, if we are looking to improve conditions for folks who stutter, if we are looking to shift the world in a positive direction for folks who stutter, we also need to be focused pretty strongly on the fluent world and shifting the way that the fluent world sees stuttering, treats stuttering, views stuttering, talks about stuttering. And so for Space, we split up our branches of our organization into sort of three pillars: arts, education, and advocacy. And the education and the advocacy piece of what we do, I think, is most centrally directed at fluent folks. So for example, on the education side, we offer listening workshops for schools and businesses and organizations. And what we're doing there is we're going into these spaces and we're saying, look, we are going to help you become better listeners through the lens of stuttering. Because we believe that when you learn to listen well to people who stutter, ultimately you are learning to listen well to everyone. And I want to pause just for a second and go down a little bit of a rabbit hole with that, because I think something that I think about all the time is like we as stuttering organizations very frequently are putting out stuttering listening tips, right? Like tips and tools for folks to use when they interact with people who stutter. But the fact of the matter is, for the general public, very often, I would say the majority of the time the general public is interacting with folks who stutter, they don't even know that they are interacting with folks who stutter, right? They might be interacting with somebody who's completely covert, or they may not be familiar with stuttering external behaviors, and they have no way of identifying that they're talking to a person who stutters. So even if we arm people with the best possible listening tips and tools and tricks, we're also asking them then to identify, oh, hey, I'm talking to a person who stutters now, like I'm going to put on my like stuttering listening hat, and now I'm going to listen well. And ultimately, I don't know that that's a realistic way for us to create the type of societal change that desperately needs to be created. Ultimately, what we need to be doing is asking people to listen better, to listen differently to everyone. And by listening better and listening differently to everyone, it's going to improve conditions for people who stutter as well. And so going back to this idea of listening workshops, right? The way that we phrase it to a school, for example, is we might say, look, for an elementary school teacher, if you as a teacher learn to listen more patiently, to establish more clear turn taking, to allow more space, to make sure that you are minimizing interruptions, that you're never finishing sentences, to make sure that you are allowing for and celebrating verbal diversity. Yes, of course, the kids who stutter in your class are going to benefit from an environment like that. But guess what? So is every other kid in that class, because we've seen time and time again over the years that when we make conditions better for marginalized populations, for disabled populations, we make things better for everyone. I think an example that always, like the clearest example of this that always comes to mind for me is the idea that when we install ramps to public buildings that make it easier for folks in wheelchairs to get into those buildings, of course, those ramps are installed predominantly with that population in mind. But when we install ramps that make it easier for folks who use wheelchairs to get into buildings, we're also making it easier for folks who have other mobility issues. We're also making it easier for folks who are older. We're also making it easier for folks with strollers. And so when we make this change to accommodate a specific population that's been marginalized, we actually make things more accessible to everyone. And so this is the way that we approach stuttering as well. When we make things better for people who stutter, when we create space for stuttering, when we learn to listen better, we learn to listen better to everyone. We make space for everyone as well. And so the final piece of the sort of like organizational puzzle for us is advocacy. And the way that we view stuttering advocacy is as follows. We think that the central reason for stuttering stigma is that generally folks don't know what stuttering looks like, they don't know what it sounds like, and they don't understand it. And so when they come into contact with it, they don't know what to do with it, they other it, they view it as wrong, or they have all of these misconceptions around stuttering, right? If you view stuttering as something that can be cured, and that if the speaker just needs to try a little harder, it's easier to be critical of stuttering. It's easier to see stuttering through a negative lens. And so we are missing all of this exposure to stuttering and understanding of stuttering. And so the general public, when they come into contact with it, they don't know what to do. And it sort of feeds the fire and fuels stuttering stigma. And one of the main reasons that we aren't having folks come into contact with stuttering is because predominantly the stuttering celebrities that we are seeing are folks who are presenting as fluent, folks who are presenting as, I overcame my stutter, I used to stutter, I stuttered when I was a child. And ultimately, those are all really fine feelings and perspectives to have as an individual who stutters. I think the issue right now is that the stuttering community predominantly is being represented by folks who aren't necessarily stuttering openly. And when we start to see representation from folks like John Hendrickson, Jordan Scott, Jerome Ellis, who are getting on TV and radio and podcasts and stuttering openly, we begin to see, oh man, these folks are smart and eloquent and creative, and they have so much to say, and also they're stuttering a lot, and their stutter is not an impediment to them communicating effectively. And so at Space, one of the things that we are really focused on right now is how do we further platform the voices of folks who stutter and folks who stutter openly, and how do we create really compelling media and tell really compelling stories around stuttering by featuring stuttered voices. And so one of the best examples of that right now is our video, The Space Between Our Words, which you can find on our website. I'll put the link to the website in the chat after this. It's spacetostutter.org. And I think that's a really fantastic example of what happens when we tell really beautiful stories that are featuring and highlighting stuttering voices. Our goal as an organization as well, thanks, Lydia. Our goal as an organization as well is to make sure that we are not embarking on this journey to create more space for stuttering, to platform stuttering voices, to get more stuttering voices into the media, to eventually have a news anchor who stutters, to shift the way that stuttering is represented in the fabric of society. We want to be really careful that we are not doing this on our own, because we really believe that no one organization has the capacity or the ability to make the type of deeply needed change happen. We believe that the best way for these changes to happen is when we build a coalition, when we build partnerships together, when we collaborate. And that's why for Space, one of our central values is partnerships, is collaboration. We know that when we start to come together, our collective voices are more powerful than our individual ones. And I think that when we look at other civil rights movements, social rights movements, disability rights movements, LGBTQ plus movements, those movements all were successful, all made progress through coalition, through community, through a number of organizations and a number of people coming together with a unified voice and fighting for the rights of that marginalized population. And the way that I see it, all of the stuttering organizations, we all have sort of overlaps in some ways, and we don't overlap in other ways. There are things we agree on, there are things that we disagree on. But ultimately, I think at the core of every stuttering organization, no matter what you believe about stuttering and the way that stuttering should be viewed or treated, I think everybody believes that people who stutter deserve to be able to take up space. People who stutter deserve to be listened to and to be heard. And I think this is a central idea that we can all agree on. And what we hope for at Space is for us to be able to partner with folks who are interested in creating change for people who stutter in this way. And so the final thing that I'll say about the way that Space works, and then I'll sort of like start to wrap up here and would love to chat with you all, see if you have any other questions or ideas here. The final thing that I'll say is, for me, as a stuttering ally leading a stuttering organization, something that has been incredibly important right from the very beginning is to make sure that the voices of those who stutter are the ones who are predominantly represented within the organization, not just sort of like in a front-facing way, but in terms of the actual way that decisions are made. We want to make sure that all of the decisions that are being made at Space, being made either by people who stutter or with heavy consultation from people who stutter. We want to make sure that as a youth-driven organization, which we are, we believe that the best way to support adults who stutter is to reach them when they are young. As a youth-driven organization, we make sure that we have input and feedback from our youth and young adult population. So we have a youth advisory committee, a young adult advisory committee. We have a group of youth and teens and young adults who have a meaningful stake in our decision-making processes. And our goal is to make sure that as we continue to grow as an organization, that we never lose that incredibly vital part of who we are, which is that we always need to make sure that people who stutter are the ones who are leading the charge for us as an organization and leading a charge in this movement. And so the final thing that I want to say as I sort of like wrap this up, we've talked about a lot of really large overarching things and sort of sometimes somewhat abstract ideas. And I think sometimes it can feel sort of like, well, excuse me, what do I do with all of that, right? Like, where do I go with all of that? How do I make an impact? It all sounds really nice, but what can I do right now? And so let's talk about a couple things you can do right now. As always, Space, like every other not-for-profit, relies on the generosity of folks to help us fund the programs that we're doing. So you can always go to space2stutter.org and donate. That's always helpful. You can reach out to us and become a part of our community. That's helpful. I think something beyond that is really front of mind for me is if you are a person who stutters, you can continue to move through your life and make the choice to share your authentic voice with your friends, with your family, with the general public. We had a really fantastic conversation last week, and one of our community members shared, and I'm paraphrasing his quote, but he essentially said, like, every moment that I choose to live authentically as a person, share my stutter, is a moment of advocacy for me. And I really believe that when folks who stutter make the choice to share their voice, to stutter openly, it makes a huge impact. I think if you are not a person who stutters, I suppose even if you are, I think one of the most valuable things that you can do is to make the choice to create space for everyone else. And what that practically means is in your conversations, and I would really challenge you to try this evening, to try it tomorrow morning. Make a conscious effort in a conversation that you're having with someone to allow a little bit more space, to feel comfortable with a little bit of silence, to, instead of filling in a sentence or waiting until the person who is speaking to you is done so that you can share, just take a moment to breathe, to allow for a little bit more space, to make sure that you are being really aware of the moments when you are speaking and the moments that you aren't. Because I really do believe that when we create space for stuttering and we create space in this world, we can have an incredibly meaningful impact, even in the space of just one conversation. Thank you all so much. It's really lovely to get to chat with you in this way. I want to just go back into the chat quickly and see Steph, thanks for sharing before about accessibility, and it's really nice to see you as well. And Lydia, thanks again for putting the link into the chat. Steph, yeah, I'll throw it over to you if you have questions or thoughts or comments.
Aidan, it's been a while. I don't remember the last I saw you, but good to see you again. Yeah, no, I just wanted to share. I think I probably told you this sentiment or this story of the first person I ever treated. I'm a speech pathologist, but I also stutter neurogenically from a head injury. I share super openly. And so the first guy I ever treated, you remind me of him every time I hear you speak. So thank you for that. I don't know if he's still living. I haven't crossed paths with him since in about 15 years, but he taught me so much about stuttering and what I thought I knew stuttering was and what I learned in school as to what stuttering is. And he very vulnerably allowed me into his world. And when I asked him his name, it took him 2.5 minutes to say his name. And my mind was like, oh, grad school did not prepare me for this. What do I do with my eyes? What do I do with my hands? And I was fluent. Then I dropped my pen. Do I pick it up? Right. And in my head, I tell my students a lot, my grad students, my head was going crazy, even though I should have been listening and engaging with him. I thought I wasn't ready. So when he finished that 2.5 minutes and saying his name and I was listening, I said, can I really, please, correct me if this is not okay to ask, but can I ask you a question? He goes, yeah, please do. I said, what do you want me to do when you stutter like that? And he said, I want you to listen to me like I was anybody else. And that's when I learned it was okay to pick up my pen if I needed it to write down something like I would anybody else, right? And so I think that the charge for creating safe spaces to listen is so powerful. So thank you for what you're doing, and I can't wait to hear more about what you guys are doing. So thanks.
Thanks, Steph. First of all, it's really lovely to see you again. It's great to see your face, and yeah, I appreciate that story. That is really meaningful and really impactful to hear. And again, it makes me just sort of think like, I don't know, I think when I first started this work, I really felt like, yeah, there's a certain way that I need to listen to best support people who stutter. There's like a technique that I need to learn. There's this sort of like, yeah, these general skills. And I think like that as well can sometimes be an obstacle for folks who don't stutter to feel like they are able to accommodate folks who do, because it feels like, oh man, like I got to learn how to do this thing. I've got to sort of like shift this part of myself. And ultimately, when we start to learn that it's not a niche set of skills. It's not this sort of like specialized, like, oh, wow, this is like this specific kind of listening. And ultimately that we learn that this is something that we can and should do with everyone in our life. I think that it goes such a long way. And ultimately that like so much of being a great listener is just being aware of when you're talking and when you're not, which I think can sound like so simple, but ultimately I think is something that we societally just aren't paying enough attention to. Is like, when is my mouth moving and when isn't it? And when can I make like a really meaningful choice to just allow for silence and allow for space? Yeah, I just want to open up the space here and see if anybody else has questions or thoughts on the idea of practically like what it can really mean to create space for stuttering. Just open up the space for a few moments here.
I was going to say, I definitely, I definitely agree that it's so much easier than people think it is. Like I just had a TikTok go viral, and a lot of people are asking. I mean, there's a lot going on with it, but one of the things that keeps coming up is people asking, like, how do I reply? Do I fill in the word? Do I tell them it's okay? Do I tell them to take their time? Do I take a deep breath with them? Like all of these things that it's like, I mean, just listen to them. Like it's just, you just let them talk. And then if they apologize, if they address it, then like, here's an idea, maybe say something like, I'm listening. Like I kind of talk to them about like I statements. So saying like I have time instead of saying take your time. Um, but most of it's just like waiting for people. And I think and the other thing that came up were people who don't stutter who were leaving comments on some of that reflection, saying like, I think a lot of times it's the listener who needs to take a deep breath. And it just was really cool to see that like, there's other people who are thinking this way about it as well. So, because I hadn't seen it really before recently with talking to people at Space and on my account as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate you as always. I'd be curious. I mean, I know that in an hour or so, like you've got quite a bit of time to talk about your own stuff as well. And so I don't want to like take away from that, but I am kind of curious if you're down to share. I've been thinking a lot about this thing of, it's important for us to create stuttering representation by putting folks who stutter out at the forefront and giving them a platform and encouraging folks who stutter openly. And for you, right, you just had this experience of where like that's exactly what you did. And I think it sounds like, right, it's been a mixed experience. I'm sure there's been feelings of like pride around it, and also it's been really hard. And so I'm curious, like, if you are down to share, and it's all good if you're not, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd be really curious to hear, like, has your perception of like what it means to stutter openly in media and like in a very public way shifted at all based on this experience of going viral and experiencing some like pretty harmful comments, or has it like made you double down? I'd just be really interested if you have further thoughts on
that. It does like kind of almost like both in a way, right? Where there's a part of me that goes, sir, I mean, I do not recommend any person who stutters goes and reads the comments on that stuff. Like we don't need to, right? Like it's not helpful. But like all of these things that it's interesting, right? Because there's a part of me that's like, well, I really don't want anyone to be faced with this, to be like exposed to this kind of stuff, because there's some mean stuff. And like, even though it doesn't hurt me, but it does, like, it's very frustrating, and it's very deflating to see just like comment after comment that's mean. But there's also a lot of really good stuff too. There's a lot of other people who stutter who are replying that's saying, wow, I haven't seen somebody stutter before, or this. And there are a lot of people that are commenting like, I started laughing really hard at first, and then I realized you stuttered and I feel bad. Which I don't know why people would say it. Like, just don't say it. Like, you don't have to say that. But it's really interesting, since I guess they did, and now I know to think, it catches them so off guard, So it's really interesting, because it does make me think, like, if people saw this more, if people were around this more, maybe they wouldn't immediately start to laugh, because it just doesn't make any sense to me, It's interesting. I definitely think that people need, like, to make sure you have a safe place first, to have people that you can go to and to feel comfortable with yourself and have, like a fallback. Because if you have something that blows up like this video has currently like 1.4 million views, which is bizarre. Like, if something like this happens, like, you will be dealing with like the bad stuff too, but having support in place already exists is like super necessary. But it does make me think we need more of it. But I think I understand almost more than before, like, why people wouldn't want to do it, right? Like, it doesn't feel good to have your voice being compared to diesel engine on a cold morning 100 times in a row. Like, that feels bad to see over and over and over, and to have helicopter emojis. Like, it's just like, it's not funny. And it's weird that like this, like there's so many people that would still find this like this level of funny to have so many of these comments. But I just feel that like if it's more normal, like you're still gonna have this, you're still gonna have things like this, especially when you go like viral on a social media thing like TikTok, where people can have fake accounts. But like the people who aren't trying to be mean, like those people I think can learn a lot from it and just be exposed to it. And maybe they reacted poorly with me this first time, but then maybe they learned something from that, and next time they'll withhold thinking it's a joke, hopefully. So yeah, it's a mixed bag of experiences, and I'm gonna talk in my session about anger and channeling some of that, because I was feeling a lot of anger, which I think is fair. Even on like behalf of me, but just these people who are choosing to be mean, and like what that means for people and kids who stutter, and the kids who don't stutter yet but will tomorrow or this week. Like, what does that look like for them, and how do we influence their world before they have to experience all of this? Like, how do we make those comments be the disgust instead of the norm?
Yeah, 100% to all that. I love listening to you talk about this stuff. Yeah, I mean, something that really sticks out to me there is sort of like, it's kind of, we want to get rid of both sides of the spectrum too, right? Like, obviously the bullying side and like the mean and awful comments like you're describing, like obviously we want to get rid of that. And also, right, like those comments that are like, oh, at first I was laughing and then I felt bad. We also kind of want to get rid of those as well, right? We don't want stuttering to be something that's pitied. We want to come right into the middle where it's just another form of speech. It's essentially, like, as weird as to say, unremarkable in the most literal sense of the word, right? Like there's no need to remark on it because it's just another form of speech. Lydia, I don't want to like put you on the spot either, but I would be really curious to hear if you have thoughts on this, especially as somebody who has like helped to create space media and is doing so much in like studying Jerome Ellis's work and like the creation of stuttering media. If you have any thoughts, I would be really interested to hear your take on all this too.
Thank you for that. Yeah, all this is sparking so many thoughts for me. I feel like it's such a weirdly good time for you to go viral, Ezra. Like right on the heels of all this stuttering pride movement. So in a way, I'm like so grateful that you're out here doing this work, and I'm so grateful that like you are in a space where you're okay to handle this. Like imagine if, I don't know, someone like younger or like without this community was facing this hate. So like, thank you for being so brave and doing it. I was thinking about creating online space, like how much work we're doing to create space in real life, like face to face kind of things. But I'm wondering what the future is going to look like, trying to create space for stuttering in media and on social media. I think TikTok can be really powerful because you're in control, right? Like no one can interrupt your video. Like you made that video, and they kind of are forced to see it in its entirety. I do think that's a really useful tool, and I love the future implications of being able to use media, videos, and like that temporal aspect of creating online space. Like that's really exciting, but also terrifying.